The air inside the habitat suddenly carried the scent of pond scum and decay. An impossible smell that had no business existing in a machine built to orbit Earth. On the central console, the atmospheric processor's oxygen purity readings began a cascade failure, turning from stable green to a pulsing, system-wide red. The engineered biology designed to give them life had just declared war. The only sound in the vacuum chamber was the faint electronic whine of the stress actuator. Inside the meter-thick polycarbonate cylinder, a brick of dark gray material sat under a hydraulic press. It was ugly, pockmarked, and looked like a lump of poorly mixed concrete. To Dr. Kenji Tanaka, it was the cornerstone of a new world, or the tombstone of a trillion-dollar dream. On the monitors arrayed around him, telemetry scrolled in silent, luminous columns of green. Atmospheric integrity, 100. Internal pressure, nominal. Tensile load, increasing. Every kilogram lifted from Earth's surface was a monument to obscene expense. The consortium's accountants called it the upmass cost, a sterile term for a number so large it behaved more like a law of nature than a market price. It was the anchor that had drowned a generation of space settlement plans in red ink. They could build a city in orbit, a rotating habitat inspired by the grand visions of Gerard K. O'Neill, but they couldn't afford to ship it there piece by piece. The logistical failures of earlier platforms, even ambitious ones built on the legacy of Orbital Reef, had taught them that brutal lesson. A civilization could not be Fed-Exed into existence. This ugly brick was the proposed solution. It was not from Earth. The regolith simulant was a perfect analog of a C-type asteroid surface, a cocktail of clays, silicates, and carbonaceous compounds. It had been fused together, not with imported epoxy, but by the focused, intense glare of a solar concentrator array, in a process they called radiative sintering. They had baked mud with sunlight to create a building material, and now they were about to see if it would hold a city together. Load at 75% of theoretical maximum, a technician's voice announced over the comms, clipped and professional. Tanaka's eyes were fixed on the microscopic surface scan. The live feed showed a magnified, alien landscape of fused grains. He was looking for the telltale sign of a propagating fracture, the hairline crack that would spell failure. The entire settlement architecture, every radiation shield, every pressure hull, every internal wall, depended on this material exceeding its minimum performance specifications. If it failed, their entire model collapsed. They would be back to launching metals from Earth, and the tyranny of the launch equation would win again. 85%, the voice said. A flicker on the screen. A single pixel shifted from grey to black. Tanaka leaned closer, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the console. It was a microvoid, a tiny pocket of gas trapped during the sintering. It was a weakness. He watched, holding his breath, as the stress field lines in the diagnostic overlay worked around the imperfection. The lines of force, rendered in false color blue, were concentrating, turning yellow, then orange. 95%. We have a stress concentration around anomaly 7 sigma. He could give the order to halt the test. They had proven the material could almost meet the standard. They could write reports, secure the next round of funding, and spend another year refining the sintering process. It was the safe, logical path. But they didn't have another year. Competing proposals were promising faster, more conventional methods. The consortium's faith was finite. Push it, Tanaka said, his voice quiet but firm. Take it to failure. A moment of silence on the comms. Confirmed, Doctor? Push to catastrophic failure? Confirmed. I need the cascade data. The whine of the actuator rose in pitch. On the monitor, the stress lines around the microvoid flared into a brilliant, angry red. The single black pixel blossomed into a jagged line, a lightning bolt of fracture tearing through the material in microseconds. A web of cracks spread across the surface, and then the brick, the cornerstone of their city in the sky, disintegrated into a cloud of grey dust and shattered fragments. The pressure alarms shrieked as the chamber was instantly depressurized. The technicians in the control room were silent, the mood funereal. Tanaka ignored them. His eyes were locked on the data that had streamed in during the final milliseconds of the brick's existence. He saw the fracture propagation dynamics, the shear stress values at the moment of failure, the energy transference patterns. It had shattered, yes, but it had held for 103% of the theoretical maximum load before the pre-existing flaw gave way. It had failed perfectly. He leaned back, the tension finally leaving his shoulders, and ran a hand through his hair. They hadn't just built a brick. They had validated a supply chain that began in an asteroid belt and ended with a home for 10,000 people. The foundation was no longer a dream, it was a data set. The dust from Dr. Tanaka's shattered brick had barely settled before the next battlefield was chosen. It was not a vacuum chamber, but a conference room paneled in dark wood and smart glass, where the only pressure was the weight of precedent. At the center of the holographic table, a model of the O'Neill-inspired cylinder rotated in silent perfection, its internal landscapes bathed in simulated sunlight. The physics were solved. Now they had to confront history. Anya Sharma, the consortium's chief counsel, pointed a stylus at the shimmering projection. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty is perfectly clear. Outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty. A government cannot plant a flag and claim ownership. But it says absolutely nothing, she paused, letting the words hang in the air, about private enterprise operating in a territory owned by no one. Across the table, Olivia Bennett, the settlement's lead architect, shifted in her seat. Her focus wasn't on legal loopholes, but on livable realities. So we're not a nation, we're a facility. A very complex, very remote facility, but one governed by the Articles of Incorporation of a Delaware C Corp. Precisely, Anya affirmed. Think of us not as a colony in the old sense, but as a charter city, like the Hudson's Bay Company or the Dutch East India Company. They were corporations vested with quasi-governmental powers by necessity because they operated beyond the immediate reach of their sovereign. We are simply updating the model for the 21st century. Our charter isn't just a business plan. It is the founding document of a society. The document projected onto the wall was titled Covenant of Artemis, a dense text of clauses and subclauses. It was a constitution disguised as a corporate manual. It covered everything from resource allocation protocols to intellectual property rights for discoveries made using non-Earth materials. Section 4, Clause 12, addressed internal arbitration, a private court system. Section 9 outlined the terms of residence, which looked far more like a grant of citizenship than a lease agreement. The work being done by commercial pioneers like Axiom Space and the teams behind Orbital Reef established the viability of private enterprise in low Earth orbit, Anya continued, her voice smooth and certain. They laid the commercial groundwork. We are laying the civic groundwork. We are creating a nation inside a machine. Olivia zoomed in on a schematic of the habitat's residential sector. Let's make this practical. An engineer invents a new, hyper-efficient protein synthesizer in her quarters. The parts are made from our asteroid-derived materials. The power is from the habitat's solar arrays. Who owns the patent? Her? The consortium? Does she owe a royalty to the community that keeps her alive? Anya tapped her stylus, highlighting a section in the covenant. Intellectual property in situ. All inventions conceived and actualized within the habitat are the property of the inventor, but the consortium retains a non-exclusive, royalty-free, perpetual license for any technology critical to habitat operation. The inventor is free to license it to any entity back on Earth. It encourages innovation while guaranteeing our survival. It was a delicate balance, a system of law born from engineering constraints. Every rule was a response to the hostile environment outside the hull. Liability wasn't just about financial damages, it was about cascading system failures that could kill everyone. Property rights weren't just about ownership, they were about the stewardship of resources so finite that a single act of waste could be catastrophic. They were drafting a social contract where the laws of physics were the primary authors. The document was less a product of legal theory and more a derivative of thermodynamics and closed-loop ecology, ideas championed for decades by the Space Studies Institute. Anya Sharma swiped her hand, and the document was digitally signed and encrypted, the protocol's completion marked by a soft chime. The covenant was sealed. It was not a declaration of independence shouted to the world, but a quiet, calculated click of a key, a binding agreement for a place that did not yet exist, a legal foundation for a city that would float in the void. The ecological core was the settlement's living heart, a full-scale, ground-based replica of the life support systems designed to sustain thousands. Housed in a sealed Nevada warehouse the size of an aircraft hangar, it was a forest of gleaming steel bioreactors, ceramic water filters, and transparent tubing. Through this circulatory system flowed the essentials of life: water purified to the last molecule, and air scrubbed clean of every carbon dioxide atom, replenished with oxygen produced by trillions of microscopic algae. For 6 months, the core had run in perfect, self-contained equilibrium. It was a flawless testament to the principles of a contained ecology Gerard K. O'Neill had envisioned decades prior. The first sign of trouble was not an alarm, but a scent. Dr. Kenji Tanaka noticed it during his morning inspection. A faint, organic tang of decay, like wet leaves. It was an impossible smell in a system where every organic molecule was meticulously tracked and recycled. He checked the atmospheric readouts, all nominal, yet. The smell persisted, a ghost in the machine. Within a week, the ghost had a voice. Alarms began to chime, not with the urgency of a critical failure, but with the quiet insistence of a system drifting out of balance. Oxygen production from the primary algae bioreactors began to fluctuate, dipping by a few percentage points before recovering. The CO2 scrubbers worked harder to compensate. Olivia Bennett, whose architectural designs relied on this system's absolute stability, reviewed the data with Tanaka. "It's like a fever," she observed, tracing the oscillating graphs on a monitor. "The system is fighting something, but the diagnostics show all hardware is functioning perfectly. There's no leak, no mechanical fault." The problem was deeper. It was biological. Tanaka's team took samples from the bioreactors. Under the electron microscope, the Chlorella vulgaris algae looked healthy, their emerald green chloroplasts vibrant. But the system's performance continued to degrade. The fluctuations grew wilder. The water reclamation system flagged an unidentified protein chain in its filters. The air began to feel heavy, stale. The cascade had begun. The sickness in the algae was now threatening the water, and the failing water purification was placing more strain on the atmospheric processors. They were not just managing a machine, they were tending a garden of unimaginable complexity, and the garden was developing a weed. The crisis came when Bioreactor 3 went critical. The oxygen output plummeted, and the water inside turned a murky, sickly brown. The core's automated systems shunted it offline, but the remaining reactors couldn't handle the increased load. The entire ecosystem, the technological lung for a city in space, was spiraling toward collapse. In the frantic hours that followed, Tanaka's team ran a full genomic sequence on the algae from the failed reactor. The answer was waiting in the code: a single point mutation. A tiny random error in the algae's DNA, likely caused by a stray cosmic ray during the initial culture growth, had subtly altered its metabolism. The new strain was more robust, outcompeting the original, but its photosynthetic process was less efficient, and, critically, it produced a complex organic byproduct the filters were not designed to process. This byproduct was the source of the protein chains, the cause of the smell, and the poison that was slowly choking their perfect machine. Olivia and Kenji stood before the colossal inert cylinder of Bioreactor 3. Inside, a dead ecosystem floated in stagnant water. The vacuum of space was a simple, honest threat. This was something far more insidious. This was life itself, in all its unpredictable, evolutionary stubbornness, refusing to be perfectly contained. They had designed a habitat where every component was essential for survival, effectively founding a town where every wall keeps people alive. But they had learned that the walls themselves, the very systems of life, were not static. The greatest challenge would not be building the city, but keeping it from evolving into something they could no longer live in. With the ghost of the mutated algae exorcised and the bioreactors reseeded with a more resilient strain, the ecological core was brought back to life. This time, however, its purpose was different. It was no longer a sterile test bed for machinery. It was to become a home. The call for applicants had gone out not to space agencies, but to universities, trade guilds, and research institutes. The consortium was not looking for pilots or mission commanders in the old mold. They were looking for settlers. The final 12 were a mosaic of hybridized skills. There was a hydrologist who was also a certified welder, a psychologist with a background in emergency medicine, and a software engineer who spent her weekends maintaining vertical farms. None had flown a supersonic jet, but all of them knew how to repair a CO2 scrubber, diagnose a systems-level software glitch, and set a broken bone. They were chosen for their psychological stability and their ingrained understanding that in a closed system, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Olivia Bennett watched from the observation deck as they sealed the main airlock, beginning a one-year simulation that would be the final green light for the orbital habitat. For the first few weeks, they followed the mission protocols with military precision. Schedules were rigid, communication was formal, and tasks were executed according to a meticulously planned roster. They were a crew, performing a mission. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It began during a routine maintenance check on the atmospheric regulators. A secondary valve actuator failed, a minor issue, easily bypassed, but one that required a 12-hour repair. On the mission plan, this was one engineer's job. Instead, Olivia watched as 4 people converged on the problem without a word. The engineer dismantled the actuator, while the hydrologist rerouted the affected coolant lines to prevent a thermal spike. The psychologist brought them coffee and quietly kept an eye on their fatigue levels, while the botanist adjusted the nutrient cycles in the hydroponics bay to account for the temporary shift in atmospheric humidity. There was no designated leader. The system's immediate need dictated the hierarchy. Expertise became a fluid, transient form of authority. They were not following a chain of command. They were flowing like water to fill a crack in the hull of their world. Their shared, unspoken knowledge was simple. The habitat was a single, complex organism, and they were symbiotic cells within it. A failure in one part was a threat to the whole. This nascent culture of radical interdependence began to manifest in small rituals. They started referring to the life support system not as ECLSS or the core, but as the lung. They took meals together, not because the schedule demanded it, but because the central hub was the warmest and brightest place. a subconscious gravitation toward the heart of their manufactured world. The formal language of the Covenant of Artemis, with its clauses on arbitration and liability, felt like an artifact from another planet. Their social contract was simpler, written in the hum of the recyclers and the green glow of the algae tanks. You keep the machine alive, and the machine keeps you alive. Looking down at the small community, moving with a quiet, shared purpose, Olivia realized they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of society. It was not born from ideology, politics, or a shared history on Earth, but forged in the crucible of a shared, fragile environment. The first city in space, she thought, may begin as an engineering project and end as a civilization. This small group, sealed in a warehouse in Nevada, were already its first citizens, their identity a direct consequence of the machine they called home. A quiet acknowledgement that the dream of a fully independent city remained a long way off, yet its cultural DNA was already taking shape. That impossible scent of decay, the first sign of a biological war, was never truly a declaration of hostility. It was a lesson. It taught the first settlers that their new world was not a sterile machine, but a living, fragile partner in their survival. The culture that emerged wasn't built on grand laws written on Earth, but on the quiet, constant hum of the lung that gave them all breath. That's a future worth thinking about, and it's what we love to explore here at Tech Dissect Official. The story presents the Covenant of Artemis as a necessary legal tool born from engineering constraints. So we want to ask you, what do you think is the single greatest danger of allowing a private corporation to write the first constitution for a society off Earth? Thanks for joining us on this journey. We explored how this civilization began, but next time we'll ask what happens when its first child is born, a citizen not of a country, but of a corporation.